also on this. So this project came about, I think partially out of my panic at the impending crisis and just wondering what I can do and having anxiety. And so I can say that working on this has had a salutary effect on my anxiety levels. I am still able to sleep at night because I guess I just have an outlet for my energy. But we're finding some very interesting results from tracking bankruptcies and thinking about what might be driving changes in trends in consumer and business bankruptcies. So here's just a quick motivational graph. So here we're showing unemployment claims since 1980, bankruptcy filings in blue, and also in red, the total judge caseload, which is a weighted average of a proxy for the total number of hours that judges have to spend on bankruptcy cases. So one way to think about the red line is that when we start to get over 1,000 total hours, that's when bankruptcy courts might start to become congested or overloaded. And another point from this graph is that we can see that, clearly bankruptcy filings only lag unemployment claims a little bit. So clearly bankruptcy filings are correlated with the macroeconomy, and that given the extent we can see, the huge amount of unemployment claims recently, we have to expect bankruptcies to, a wave of bankruptcies to come, and that bankruptcy policy is an important lever. In consumer terms, about 1 or 2 million people on average file per year. So thinking about bankruptcy policies is an important aspect of dealing with this crisis. So I'm just going to summarize this slide, and I should also say that the slides are on the Slack in case you want to follow along at home. So, we just want to think about, kind of what is going on in the bankruptcy system and what are potential policies that could ease the burdens on the courts as well as consumers and businesses. So some objectives, and I'll say here that we're just going to deal with the first point today. We're not going to have a chance to get to number 2, but our short-term objectives of this project are just trying to empirically understand what is happening to bankruptcy filings. Are they going up? Are they going down? And then try to understand what would be driving changes in bankruptcy outcomes. And I will say that our initial results so far have been a little surprising, in that kind of what motivated this project for me is being worried that we're going to have a huge wave of bankruptcies. And in fact, thus far, we have not seen that, and in fact have seen the opposite. And so I look forward to some discussion in the group to help us brainstorm and understand why might that be happening. So what are our initial findings? So this is a quick, our data. Feel free to take a look and ask us more questions about the data later. So our key findings so far is that as of April, we are seeing a drop in consumer bankruptcies, which is the vast majority of all bankruptcies in the US. So as of March, both consumer and business bankruptcies are more or less on the seasonal trends that we observed since 2019. But basically in the past 2 weeks, we've seen a noticeable drop in consumer filings, but business filings still staying on trend. And then sort of the question is if that is a real result, which I'll just skip forward to show you right here. So this is consumer filings. So this is what I'm talking about, the last 2 data points right here. And this is very bad academic form to be writing a paper about two data points right now, but we're essentially monitoring the crisis and trying to understand what's going on in real time. Okay, so now back to, well, if it's the case that consumer bankruptcies are falling, and I'll show you some regression results toward the end as well, why might that be the case? So we sort of brainstormed a few ideas, some of the probably first order mechanisms that might be going on. One is that substitutes for consumer bankruptcy are expanding, such as the CARES Act, unemployment insurance. Lenders seem to be nicer to people, not, sort of allowing informal or formal forbearance and moratoria on evictions and foreclosures and things like that. Another thing that I think is probably very important is that households are kind of shutting down, whether that's rational or irrational. There's a lot of economic uncertainty right now on if you were furloughed, are you going to be able to get your job back? So it could potentially make sense, but there's also anecdotal evidence of potential just mental scarcity, that bankruptcy is just not top of mind right now when you're just trying to figure out how to maintain your household. And then, obviously the courts themselves are shutting down, and I'll show you some evidence on that, and liquidity constraints, which we've shown in previous work, it takes money to file for bankruptcy. If you've just been laid off, you might not be putting that $1,000 that you do have in the bank toward filing for bankruptcy. I'm going to skip through. There's some really interesting anecdotal evidence that we sort of gathered very recently on all of these points. So one piece of suggestive evidence, this is kind of a shout out to Paul on Google Trends, kind of to go back to our list of trying to at least qualitatively disentangle these mechanisms, is looking at Google Trends. So are people interested in filing? So is it the case that lots of people want to file, but they just can't go physically to the court? And Google Trends suggest that it's not the case. So number 3 and number 4 seem to cut against the Google Trends evidence. That it just seems like interest in bankruptcy itself is falling at this point. So this is just the raw data, and I'm going to show you regression evidence in a second. This is just more evidence on the the 2 corporate heavy courts, New York Southern District and Delaware, where the biggest corporations file. We're seeing this divergence between business filings more or less on trend and a decrease in consumer filings in both of those courts. All right, moving on to regression evidence. So what are we doing here? So again, this is just the most basic piece of evidence we can find. Disentangling causal mechanisms is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, I think, in terms of our research and probably most research on the COVID-19 crisis. But our first stab at this is to just look at the timing of different interventions, going back to the earlier paper, NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as state emergency, declaration of state of emergency on the state level, as well as state governors or governments telling everyone to stay at home. And then we're also going to look at court policies. So obviously, if you're looking at bankruptcy filings, it matters whether you can actually file for bankruptcy, and is it possible to file online? So we're going to look at these 3 sets of policies in our results today. Try to look at some of these mechanisms. So this is a very basic event study. I do want to throw it on there. So what we're looking at is at the daily level, we're looking at the number of bankruptcies per day per either at the state level or at the bankruptcy district level. There's 90 districts around the US. Some states have multiple districts. And we're just saturating all of this seasonality. So we're just throwing in dummy variables for day of the week, day of the month, month of the year, and then also either the state or the district fixed effect. So this is a pretty standard, very simple event study framework. We're just looking at the timing of these different NPIs and the effects on total bankruptcy filings in logs and in levels. Okay, so first, the first couple of policies we're going to look at, the state level shutdown. So either declaring a state of emergency or declaring kind of stay-at-home orders for everyone. So this is a distribution of when different states implemented these 2. So I think all states by now have declared a state of emergency, and these were earlier than the stay-at-home orders. So we can see the peak was about March 13th. There's some distribution, and then the stay-at-home orders tended to follow after the state of emergency declaration. So we see Washington way at the front of the state level stay-at-home order of February 23rd, I think it was, and then all other states basically like kind of a month later. So this is the timing of the events we're looking at, and of course we do see that they're staggered. Of course, the caveat that these are not randomly assigned applies, so we're simply trying to just look at the next level of descriptive evidence to try to see how the trends in bankruptcies line up. So I'm just going to show consumer. So all is essentially the same as consumer because the vast majority of all bankruptcies are consumer bankruptcies. So I'm just going to show consumer versus business. And this is consistent with our earlier findings that it's not even just the last 2 weeks, that once we take out all that seasonality, which has a lot of noise in the time series, we do see significant drops in consumer bankruptcy. So again, this is controlling for full saturation of all seasonality compared with 2019. So on the left column is the timing of the declaration of a state of emergency, and the right column is the stay-at-home orders. So I don't know. I'm not going to draw too much in terms of causal inference. The timing seems to line up a little bit more on the earlier side, that the decline in the number of consumer bankruptcies seems to have started around, March 13th-ish, as opposed to March, 25th-ish. So on the earlier side, around the timing of when states declared a state of emergency. All right, so, and again, on, you know, the next result I'm going to show is just this null result on businesses. So we're seeing, you know, no change essentially in business filings, but we are seeing a decline in consumer filings. So that's just the stylized fact that we, you know, we're coming up with, and then hopefully trying to understand. All right, so the final type of NPI, or, you know, kind of court level intervention we're going to look at is, of course, it's extremely important for filing for bankruptcy. What is actually happening logistically at the courts? Can you literally file? So, of course, you know, it's certainly the case that some people are filing for bankruptcy. So clearly, you know, about more than 5,000 individuals per week are filing for bankruptcy. Let's see, on the business side, over 200 businesses are still filing for bankruptcy. So it's not the case that all courts are just totally, you know, not working. But certainly, of course, court shutdowns will have an impact, could have an impact and have a slowdown on the number of bankruptcies. So what are we looking at here? So this comes from the US court's website, basically listing every single court order and what exactly is each individual court doing in terms of its operations. And so the key event that we're going to be looking at, and again, I think nearly all, you know, nearly all of the 90 total US bankruptcy courts have implemented something like this. So this is example I put up here, which is from the Middle District of Alabama and dated March 27th, essentially is just saying all hearings will be held telephone. It's really funny that they're using the word telephonically, but I assume that just means via Zoom, via some kind of non-physical presence, and that this, you know, applies. So essentially, this is where we're just looking at the timing of this key event for every single court. So when they're shutting down all physical hearings and moving all hearings to telephonically. And anecdotally, it does seem that if you want to file for bankruptcy, for the most part, you can do it via the electronic filing system, which is actually where we get our data. Okay, in my last 1 or 2 minutes, so this is, again, the histogram of the timing of these events when the courts started shutting down. Of course, very collinear with the 2 other types of NPIs we already looked at, so I'm not going to draw causal evidence. This is not independent of the other event studies I showed by any means. But, you know, the final result I'm going to show today is just, again, showing that null result on businesses. So businesses, you know, are still seem to file, and I personally am still very worried about just an incoming tidal wave, a latent tidal wave of small business bankruptcies and probably some large business bankruptcies as well. But they're certainly not delaying. And again, we're finding this consumer. So it seems to line up with the kind of earlier mid-March timeline. So kind of around the March 10th to March 15th timing of these events, as opposed to later in March or April. So that's all I have for our results for today. I really look forward to everyone's questions and comments on the Slack and in the Q&A. Thank you so much.